Lynn, what is it like to work with kids like that on a regular basis? I mean, you've said that you were really fearful about climate change. Do they change that for you?
Absolutely. The kids give me hope. They have right from the very beginning, when I started doing kids' books and then going around and seeing what these kids were capable of doing. One of the things was when there was this Belt Woods, it was this 60-acre, big, huge woods. And for 7 years, the adults had been trying to save it. And the Episcopal Church wanted to sell it. And it was these kids' letters, like kids wrote to the bishop of the Episcopal Church, God is going to be really mad at you. And so they read their letters on Sunday Morning with Charles Osgood, and after 7 years of not being able to save that, overnight, they saved that piece of land. Kids, same thing. They go testify for water pollution. These towns that want to have more pollution able to go into the river. The kids testify. The kids say, we just want this river the way it was when you were kids. You could fish in it, you could swim in it, and you could drink it. That's the end of the debate. So kids have this amazing power. So that was actually the reason I started doing the films. But yes, it feeds me. It just really feeds me to see how much energy they have, the positive energy, and the success that they have when their voices are heard.
What would you say to potential critics who would say you're playing an emotional trump card? That you're pulling something that's not really fair in a debate about hard choices to bring in kids and say, well, how can you say no to kids?
These kids are fighting for their future. This is the world that they are inheriting. It's the world what we've done to this world. They're inheriting it. It's like what they say in the movie about, it's like, being like Harry Potter who has just inherited this terrible thing. And they have to fight for their lives. They have to fight for the planet. And so I feel that to give them a voice, that's the least I can do. I've been trying to figure out how to even give them a bigger voice, how to get these films out there so every kid will know they have power. And because I think the kids' voice could really just completely turn around this debate on climate on this whole climate change issue. If every kid was going home and saying to their parents, do you love us? Do you care about our future? It would be over.
I didn't even have to pull that, and being a 12-year-old and simply going home and demanding recycling actually worked. So,
Good.
Matt and Melinda, I wanted to ask you, actually kind of playing off what you just said, Lynn, about being born into a system, and that's something that you guys always also touch on. And it takes away maybe one of the obstacles for adults facing and dealing with this problem, which is the guilt associated with it. Do you think that empowers kids to be able to face this problem more, being guilt-free about it?
This is something that's really interesting. Having worked with young people, I think really across the nation, we've gotten different kinds of feedback from youth about how they feel about the issue, knowing that it came down from previous generations. A lot of them feel really hurt and sort of betrayed, but they also realize, I've got to do it. Like the girls said, it's up to us. So I think that they're motivated, and I think that it's probably a little bit of a boost that they also have something that they can fix.
Yeah.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I think it's important to recognize that when fossil fuels were embraced and were decided to be the core source of energy for our country and for the world, that was before there was a real deep understanding of what the widespread impacts were going to be decades down the line. However, that frame only goes so far, and there is this important question that everyone has to ask themselves. When I knew what I now know in terms of the impacts of burning fossil fuels as the core source of energy, what did I do about it? And I think young people understand that they have an opportunity to know earlier than previous generations did that this is something that is a challenge, but also an opportunity for them to really shape a brighter future. But they are going to hold accountable those who do have the knowledge and who aren't taking every action that they can. And so, similar to what Lynn was saying, there is this sense of transparency that young people demand of those who have power. And they understand that as a young person, they don't have the kind of power that a policymaker does. And so they're going to make sure that those in power understand that that's an important consideration. They are key stakeholders, and their voice is really important to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Ty, this is a workshop on digital media in climate education. And this is a generation for which a whole realm of digital media is just their native environment. And within the journalism realm, there's been a lot of angst, perhaps, about who is a journalist, who is not a journalist, and the idea that possibly everybody could be a journalist. Do you think that journalism and storytelling through media is a more powerful tool for kids today than it might have been before, or perhaps a more attractive and comfortable medium?
Absolutely, right? So our kids have access to cameras on their phones, and they could basically just whip it out and start telling stories. But during our Google Hangout, Mary, who you met earlier, was quick to point out that citizen journalism is great, but these kids that are going through the Student Reporting Labs program, they understand that they have to tell reports based on facts, that they have to tell both sides of the story, and that they're given the proper training to make sure that the stories that they're telling are fair and balanced. So, we love to give the opportunity for as many kids to tell their stories, but they also realize the responsibility that they hold and in their storytelling process.
At the same time, I mean, they have to have the right training, mm-hmm. but they also were pointing out that there are perhaps stories or aspects of stories that they, as young people, might be better able to get than an adult would. Is that another part of this universal accessibility of kids?
I would say so. Mary talks about how a lot of people in Montana didn't even realize what bucket biology was, and that introducing illegal fish specimens into their water was a problem. And so she told us, she's like, it was so cool to inform adults and to have older people come up to me and say, hey, I didn't know that this was a problem, and now I'm going to take action. So it's really exciting for our kids.
So the question that we got from the hashtag before lunch, I've clearly adopted as our theme for this strand, and that's how does education translate into activism? And then there was another little question below that, which is that the end goal? And I wonder, in the journalism realm, do you see what they're doing as a form of activism? And is there any, the fairness, the balance, but is there any conflict or any tension there?
So it's tricky, right? We encourage our kids to inform their audience and to parlay the facts and to tell both sides. Now, if they're inspiring their colleagues and their peers to go out and take action, then that's like an added bonus.
Do we have any questions in the audience for our panel before we head out to the unconference? We have a couple there. We've got a microphone right there, Frank.
So I guess one of the questions I have in this panel, in this space, is as a result of the engagement, and we have young students who are in the room with us who've been part of this, the activism piece is one piece of the story, but then there's the rest of their life. And the question I want to know is, what else beyond the asking for policy change and other things, what other roles do they see? Because they've had a unique opportunity that, while you've engaged 2 million students, there's a lot more out there. There are 54 million at the K-12 level. What's the other part of that story that they take, because they're changed people. Mm-hmm. They accept this, they see it, and they change. And they change in a lot of ways. Activism might be one pathway, but what are the other ones that you've seen beyond that? So it's a more complete story of how those engagements work.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's a really strong question. And, climate change, it can be described as a wicked problem. There's no one solution. There's no one discipline. There's not one type of inclination or one type of creativity that's going to be the solution to solving this. It requires a real understanding of complex interactions, of climate science, of engineering solutions, of civic engagement, of justice issues and international policy. And when I think about your question of what comes next after that first initial spark happens, one of the things that we are so invested in ACE is making it clear that the solution has not been discovered yet. And in fact, every young person that we reach has an opportunity to be part of that game-changing solution. We do know that it requires really strong communication. It requires young people to build a sense of cultural excitement among their peers, among their families, among their communities to really embrace this. And it requires a sense of creativity to find the things that individuals or groups of young people are interested in and focusing that on the climate challenge. So in some way, it's tapping into this intellectual curiosity, but in a way that thinks expansively and finding kinds of solutions that can be globally reaching.
Lynn, you stay in touch with your kids, right?
Yes.
What do they go on to do?
We do. We've actually done a TV show with Emerald Planet, which has been really cool because we show clips from the film, and then the kids, how they are today, will then be Skyped in. So we've done quite a few on them. But I think now most of the kids, they understand that yes, there are a lot of solutions, but the number one thing we need to do is to have a tax on carbon. Because if we do that, then it kind of levels the playing field, and it makes everything else so much easier. So I know that many of the kids are working on talking to their politicians. A lot of them are going to their local towns and trying to make their town as carbon-free as possible. That's a really just town by town, so they're working locally. And so that's sort of big bang for the buck if the town can just decide that they want to try and get off fossil fuels town by town. So there are some pretty systemic solutions that kids can really be spearheading and are spearheading.
If I can add, one thing that I've been really excited to see is that beyond activism, beyond high school with some of the students that we work with, they've identified through different training programs what their passions are, and that, like you said, it's transformational, so it infuses the rest of their work. And so there are these new fields that are coming out, environmental law. You have people who are looking into, we have students who are going to college for these new fields that I probably couldn't even pronounce, but they're looking at ways that they understand they're passionate and they are skilled. They can also bring their care for the environment with them. So I think that all of the work that has been exposed today really shows that when you treat students holistically as a whole person, not just focusing on the environmental aspect, you can find those actions beyond activism for sure.
And I'd like us to add something to that, because this sort of builds on this, is that a lot of times kids just feel like they have to go into, get a job when they get out of school, that there's only, they have to go work for a company. And what this teaches them is that they can make a job, that they can ask what in the world needs to be done? What are the most important things that need to be done in the world? And how can I, with my particular talents, do those things, starting something new, starting a nonprofit, starting a company. So it's thinking outside the box that way.
Okay, one last question.
A lot of the grown-ups who currently run the world, some of whom do stuff for the money, I think used to be kids that had a lot of hope and optimism and less of a money focus. So I have loved seeing all the inspiring, awesome ways that young people are getting involved. Is there any concern that that young people, as they turn into adults, may become disengaged? Or I'm getting the impression from all of the young-focused education that we are kind of hoping that the young people will take over and fix things, like almost as if we've sort of written off the current adults' ability to fix things. So how can we make sure that that works out?
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
Well, I think this really gets to the question of how can we be sure that the kind of influence that we're having on young people has the greatest possible chance of lasting. A friend of mine, Max Boykoff at University of Colorado Boulder, did this great study that showed that there was a very tight correlation between fluctuations in public opinion or around climate change and how often it appears in the media. And there have also been studies that show that if you can deepen the level of knowledge based on climate science education, you can make an individual more resilient and more resistant to those ebbs and flows of whatever they're being exposed to by the media. So I do think education, deep education, a real solid understanding of the fundamentals is an important piece of making the influence lasting. And I also think that there's a cultural element to it as well. We know that young people have huge influence in their peer groups, in their homes, in their school communities, also now on social media, in ways that if we are smart about making the culture around climate change shift dramatically, there's going to be this momentum that builds that there won't be as many opportunities for them to disconnect or to change their perspective because this tide will be rising for the entire country.